This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our website. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon and support us. We are counting on you. Yes, you.
This episode is part of a series generously sponsored by the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, focused on democracy, populism, authoritarianism, and all of its causes, symptoms, and manifestations. We are very pleased this week to welcome Nancy Rosenblum speaking to us today from Cape Cod. She is the Senator Joseph Clark Research Professor of Ethics in Politics and Government at Harvard University. She has published 5 books. We won't be able to list all of them, but we'll be talking today about her most recent book, co-authored with Russell Muirhead of Dartmouth University. And a lot of people are saying that it's a great book. It's called, a lot of people are saying, The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy, published by Princeton University Press in 2019. Professor Nancy Rosenblum, welcome to the show.
I'm happy to be here.
We're happy to have you too. I want to start out with the most important word in your title, which I consider to be the word new. What is new about the kind of conspiracism that you and your colleague have examined in this book? Can you kind of enumerate the main ways that the new conspiracism differs from regular, normal conspiracy theories that are out there? And then we'll break them down.
That's a terrific starting point. Conspiracy theory is as old as politics, and it's very commonplace. Most people, by some estimates, believe in some conspiracy theory or another. And what conspiracy theory is a theory. It's an explanation of an event that says that things are not as they seem, that there's really a covert plot going on by powerful actors. And the reasoning in conspiracy theory is the same as reasoning in any kind of theory. You accumulate evidence and the dots add up to a pattern, and the pattern reveals an intent, and so on. And the example that I like to give of a conspiracy theory, because it resonates with Americans, is the Declaration of Independence. That is, the United States began with a conspiracy theory. It says that all these truths are self-evident, that men are created equal, but the conspiracy that the British were leveling against the colonies was not self-evident. And so the Declaration of Independence consists, in fact, of a long list of grievances against the Crown and the ministers. And this evidence added up to evidence of a plot, a pattern, an intention to enslave the colonies. And that's why there had to be a war of independence and not just a redress of grievances or reconciliation with the Crown. So that's conspiracy theory. It's thinking the way we ordinarily think, and some conspiracy theories are true. Some are warranted.
Isn't that just such a complicated fact, such a complicating factor of this whole thing?
Yes, yes. And there are plenty of progressive conspiracy theories, like dark money in American politics, or the fossil fuel company promoting misinformation about climate change. Now, what's new is that today we have conspiracy without the theory. That is, we have people making bare assertions without any evidence and without any argument. For example, the election was rigged, or that climate change is a Chinese hoax, or that this or that action was the work of the deep state. Conspiracism today dispenses with evidence and argument. It's an aggressive assertion, or it's an innuendo, like I'm just asking questions. And this is very important. We're not just creating a typology or stating that something has changed. This change is significant. If you ask how this conspiracy without the theory is validated, it's simply validated by repetition, by liking and tweeting and repeating it and sharing it and so on. And that explains our title, A Lot of People Are Saying, right? Because that's the evidence that a lot of people are saying this thing. You have assent, you have repetition, you have affirmation. And in doing this, people buy into this claim, and they identify with others who affirm it. 47% of Republicans, for example, believe that President Trump won the popular vote. And then what's interesting is, why is it that people buy into this? And the explanation that we give is that they are creating this political identity, this we, this assent and affirmation. And we make the claim that for many people, the question of whether they believe these conspiracist claims or not is not the right question, because the truth is not at issue. The phrase we use is, it's true enough. And I can give you some examples of that.
I wonder, Nancy, why do you think, what are the root causes of that? What really instigated this change from old conspiracism to the new one?
Well, some of the factors are constant, and there are numbers of sociological explanations for why conspiracy claims arise, and cognitive psychology and political psychology talk about it as well. But I think that there are a couple of proximate causes that explain this new conspiracism, this conspiracy without the theory. One, and it's significant, I think that the internet plays an important part. And it's not just because it's so easy to share and circulate these kinds of conspiracy claims, but also because you have other factors involved. You have conspiracy entrepreneurs who make money by both creating and propelling these theories. And because the way you validate conspiracy without the theory, it's not evidence and argument, but just a lot of people are saying. The internet is important because you can, in a sense, measure how many tweets or likes or shares and so on there are. So it makes a lot of people are saying true enough. So part of it is the internet, but I think that, and this would be going on regardless, I think, of the current political scene in the United States, especially. But what's making this dangerous and what's making it so effective, this conspiracy without the theory, is that it's coming from the highest levels of government, and that spreads it. And we have someone who, in President Trump, wants to, the phrase I use is own reality. He wants to own reality. And he owns this reality by making these assertions and claims and making them constantly and having them repeated. He has a compromised sense of reality, and he has the capacity, the institutional capacity and the political support to impose his compromised sense of reality on the nation. And I think that's the answer to the question, why now?
Yeah, so the thing is, I think I'm going to try and maybe challenge you that it's not so much an epistemological change, but it's really the fact that this a spirit of conspiracism is coupled with a tremendous amount of political power that in a way also feeds back into its visibility, right? Because the president of the United States is a conspiracist, therefore, by virtue of his own standing and role, he can spread it a lot more effectively than all the conspiracists put together could have done before him.
I think that both are true. I don't think we have to choose between them. Clearly, the political impact, and we can talk about that in a minute, the political impact of conspiracism would not be what it is if it hadn't been for the fact that a president and a compliant, sometimes cynical, sometimes go along a Republican Party supports him and doesn't speak truth to conspiracism. All of that's important. But I would never want to underestimate the epistemological divide. And maybe I can say a word about that, because I think it's one of the most important, strangely political consequences of this new conspiracism. That is, what's at stake in whether you assent to a conspiracist claim or not is nothing less than what it means to know something. And when you have a country that's divided over what it means to know something, what it means to know that Hillary Clinton is running a child sex trafficking ring out of ping pong pizza in Washington, D.C., is an extraordinary kind of divide. I think it makes for a kind of polarization that's deeper and more important even than partisan polarization. And it's more destructive of politics. Because when you have this disjuncture about what it means to know something, whether you dispense with evidence and argument or not, it makes really politics impossible.
I want to second that. I want to support your explanation, because I think that what it comes down to in your explanation is that the new conspiracism has no theory and no evidence, which essentially is an undermining of what we think of as Enlightenment values. Has this introduced a new way of thinking in the entire sort of post-Enlightenment world that is, on some level, at the heart of American identity? I mean, you have a great quote in there by David Bryan Davis, who says that the American Revolution conditioned Americans to think about tearing off the veil of dark plots against people as part of a national identity. We see the truth. We are transparent. We are all about evidence and transparency. That's considered fundamental to democracy. So is this introducing sort of a new political force? And what's the relationship? I know this is long, but what's the relationship with that to ideology? Because you have a point that you make about how this thinking is related to ideology or not.
Let me begin by saying that the David Bryan Davis quote on the Enlightenment or anti-Enlightenment question really turns on whether we're talking about conspiracy theory, which is consistent with Enlightenment. In fact, there's a wonderful quote that I've used that says that social science just is conspiracy theory. Because insofar as what social science wants to do is to reveal sort of hidden currents of how power flows and who actually holds it and how they're wielding it, right? It amounts to conspiracy theory. And we talk in the book about the progressive era in American politics, very pro-democratic, made all sorts of permanent institutional democratic reforms. And it was based on a conspiracy theory about smoke-filled rooms that chose candidates and closed-up boardrooms of monopoly industries. So conspiracy theory, I think, is consistent with what we're calling Enlightenment theory. And conspiracy without the theory clearly is not. And the question is, what those people who assent to these conspiracist claims without the theory, who are part of this epistemic divide that I'm describing, why are they doing it and what does it mean to them? And it's not so much a wholesale rejection of the difference between truth and falsity or evidence or lack of evidence, as the fact that with regard to certain claims, these conspiracist claims, what matters is whether they are true enough. And the standard of whether they're true enough is whether they are correlated to and support a certain view of the political world and political enemies and the extent to which political enemies would do. Let me give you just an example of what true enough sounds like. A congressman, for example, says, I'm not saying that the Democrats created the clash in Charlottesville, the racist clash. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it's plausible. That is to say, on a certain view of politics, whether or not you know that the Democrats did this nefarious thing, it's plausible that they did. My best example of this is Trump's press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders. They communicated a false video, it turned out, of a Muslim attack on Americans. And when confronted with the claim that this video was a doctored video, the press secretary replied, whether it's a real video, the threat is real. That is to say, these things are true enough. Whether Hillary Clinton is running a child sex trafficking ring out of the basement of a pizza parlor is true enough if you think that Hillary Clinton is so evil that she could very well be doing those things. Or
the example that I particularly appreciated, which is, do we have any evidence that Supreme Court Justice, now deceased, Antonin Scalia was not poisoned? Can we prove it? And that's a sort of a strange, counterintuitive, counterfactual. Maybe you can explain that one too.
Right. Well, there is the general argument, which I think tends to be true, that conspiracy thinking of all kinds is a closed loop. That is, any evidence against this conspiracy theory is actually evidence for it, because who's concocting this evidence against the claim, right? The enemy is concocting the evidence against the claim. So I think that there are two very critical consequences of this. I'm not interested in creating a typology of conspiracy claims, with or without the theory and so on. What's interesting to me is what are the political consequences of this, and I think they've been drastic. One has to do with what we've been talking about. That is the disorientation that comes from hearing unwarranted or unsupported conspiracy claims and knowing that so many people are supporting them. It often seems as if those people who corroborate Trump's claims, and I'll give an example in a second, are either cynical or really they're engaged in an act of submission to what it means to know something. So that's one, and we've begun to talk about that. But I think the other, less obvious and in a sense more important consequence of conspiracy without the theory, these unsupported claims, is the way it delegitimizes crucial democratic institutions, that it has clearly undermined, delegitimated all kinds of knowledge-producing institutions, both inside government and out, from the intelligence agencies to the Environmental Protection Agency to the Justice Department. And it has delegitimated, and perhaps this is the most important point, it's delegitimated the notion of partisan opposition. You can't have democracy unless you have confidence in this idea of a loyal opposition. And what this conspiracy claim pounded on for years now has done is to say that the opposition is a political enemy and should be rendered impotent.
Nancy, I would like to focus on the idea of on the danger that it poses to democracy, but more. If there's really no evidence and no foundation and really no theory or any legs to stand on, I wonder how really dangerous it is. Because as you write in the book, the way to confront that or to address these issues is to confront the conspiracists with reality. And since you wrote the book, there have been two major issues confronting the American people with, the doing of the conspiracists. I mean, one is the really incompetent handling of the COVID-19 pandemic in America by the administration, and the other one is the civil unrest that we've seen, and also causing some, confrontation to the way the reality is posed. Do you think that there's any moment of reckoning either underway right now or just around the corner, saying, maybe, the new conspiracism is good on paper, but when it actually comes to running the country and, taking care of our lives, there's a limit to it?
That's a terrific question. And let me start by saying that I don't think that, let me put it this way, I don't think that reality bites in most circumstances, and that just speaking truth to these unwarranted conspiracist claims is a way of defeating them. And that's because, it's because of where I began, which is that the devastating consequences are coming from the fact that we have a president with a compromised sense of reality, who wants to own reality, and who has the capacity to impose it on the nation. And that he's done that by delegitimating basic democratic institutions. And when I say they are delegitimated, I mean more than that they're mistrusted. I mean that they lose their meaning and their value and their authority. I mean, if there's a deep state, then the products of these institutions have no claim on your consent or even your compliance. And he's also able to not just delegitimate institutions, but to structurally alter them, to derail them, sending the army to the southern border to protect against illegal immigrants, or hijacking them, using the Justice Department to investigate people, or inventing new institutions, all kinds of commissions, and so on. And so what the danger that's coming is not simply from the unreality of these claims or the attempt to own reality, but the capacity to alter institutions in order to impose that reality on the nation. And that's especially true, as I say, about the rejection of legitimate political opposition.
Right.
It's not just polarization and that the opposition is an enemy. And so that brings us to your question about whether some things that happen in the world that are unavoidably happening and you would think could not be wished away or claimed to evaporate, test the power of this conspiracism and this attempt to own reality. And my answer is yes or no. In fact, we just wrote a column to the paper about the COVID virus question. And it's clear that when faced with disease and mortality, people will not accept and don't accept Trump's original claim that there was no virus, that it was a hoax, that the Democrats were cooking it up, and so on and so forth. Even he had to back down from his original unwarranted claims. But it just means that the conspiracy claims have shifted from whether there's a virus or the origins of the virus to whether this virus is imposing a real health hazard or not. And here he has an enormous number of people, both in government, his whole party, and people in the population who go along with the claim that to keep on imposing restrictions on people for the purposes of avoiding too many deaths is to hurt the economy and to hurt him in his reelection, and that it's sufficiently contained and that so that things can be opened up and so on and so forth. So yes, it's shifted from this belief in the claim that this thing isn't real to conspiracy accounts of responses to it.
One of the things I think is particularly interesting about your approach is that what you're describing, the disorientation, the delegitimization of institutions, and the fact that Trump is leveraging this in this way, seems to lay the classic foundation for authoritarianism, because people can't know anything. They believe they can't really know what's going on, so the state can come in and just do what it wants. But on the other hand, you argue that this new conspiracism is not really about advancing a political ideology of any one sort. How do you reconcile those two ideas?
Let me begin with the ideology part of your question. I think that the Republican Party, as it stands today in the United States, has certain, it's not an ideological party really, but it has certain policies that it absolutely wants to inflict, is my view, on the country. And one has to do with tax policies and maintaining the status and the income of corporate America, and the other has to do with conservative claims and loading the courts with people who will go along with certain kinds of views. So the Republican Party has objectives, and Trump has, by and large, acceded to these. I don't think he particularly cares about either one, certainly not religion, but he has acceded to them. And the result is that you have this real alliance between conservatives and Trump. But that's not to say that there's an ideology at work here. That is, I don't think that any of the Trump and the conspiracists are aiming at anything but delegitimating the opposition. Now, if you count authoritarianism as an ideology, then there's no question that the president and the people he surrounds himself with and that he puts into office in these agencies have an authoritarian bias. But you can have an authoritarian bias without having any particular ideology, right?
That's a good
any
point.
Particular set of things. So there is an authoritarian tendency, and it has been acted on and successful more than I would have thought when I started out on this project. I, like many people, thought that there were institutional and political guardrails that would cabin this authoritarianism, and to some extent it has. So you have these authoritarian tendencies. I think that to go back to your earlier question, we've seen it more spectacularly than ever in this business of calling out the military and the National Guard to face up these protesters against racial injustice. And that's been really quite extraordinary. And it's that has led generals and others to publicly, for the first time, come out and criticize Trump and say that he's dangerous. But that's the most dramatic and act of authoritarianism, and the one that has, as I say, turned important factors of the government, like the military, against him.
You do focus a lot on Trump and the Republican Party, even in this interview and also in the book. And indeed, you say that the new conspiracism is mainly the mainstay of the right and not so much of the left. Why do you think that is?
And how do you count anti-vaxxers?
I don't know the partisan composition of anti-vaxxers. There's certainly all kinds of conspiracy theories or claims that events can only be explained by conspiracy that are both right and left, and sometimes they're conjoined, and I expect that vaxxers or anti-vaxxers are one of them. But if you look at the conspiracy claims about 9/11, for example, there are all kinds of them, and sometimes the right and the left are combined in saying that the government was actually involved, although they're saying it for different reasons, and so on and so forth. But I think that, as a rule, the left is certainly not without conspiracy thinking, but the left seems to stick pretty much to conspiracy theories, right? To long books are written about dark money in the United States and how corporations camouflaging or seizing democracy. Or, as the example I used before, whole books and even movies have been made about the fossil fuel industry and other corporate interests leading the nation to believe that there's a dispute about climate change and its origins and so on. So there's plenty of conspiracy theory coming from the left. But by and large, I haven't seen the left doing the kind of unsupported, non-theoretical, bare claims that the right has done, and that, or much less manufacturing them. Don't forget, I began by saying that we have out there these conspiracy entrepreneurs who say that mass murders like the Sandy Hook school massacre are staged, or even now they're saying that the murder of George Floyd was staged. Right, this kind of thing you don't get from the left.
Yeah. I do think one of the interesting distinctions you make, I just want to point out for our listeners, one of the interesting distinctions I think you make is between conspiracy theories that are out there to explain something that people think the evidence hasn't explained sufficiently, and theories about things that don't need to be explained or don't exist yet, like, original storylines like the Pizzagate. I think that was an interesting distinction that you make.
Right. I thank you for bringing that up. In fact, we've gone past what we wrote about in the book, where there we said that, yes, sometimes both conspiracy theories and conspiracy claims speak about real events. Sometimes conspiracy claims, these conspiracies without the theory, are inventing events, like the murder of Justice Scalia. But now we have something new coming from Trump himself, and that is that there's no event at all, and a bizarre claim about it. I don't know if you all have heard about Obamagate, this conspiracy claim against President Obama. And what's extraordinary about it is that there's no accusation. Let me go back a minute and say that I got interested in this question right after Trump was inaugurated. He had claimed that the crowd at his inauguration was the biggest crowd in American history, bigger than Obama's, and so on and so forth, his usual grandiosity. And the next day, the National Park Service, which has this charge, released photographs of the inaugural crowd, and it was a modest crowd. It was not what he had claimed. And his immediate reaction, supported by people in his administration, was that the National Park Service had doctored the photograph. This had me agog. They doctored the photographs. It didn't say who, it didn't say, and so on and so forth. So I say this because we've now gone even past that kind of claim with Obamagate. if you ask Trump, and he was asked by a reporter, what was it that he was accusing Obama of doing? He said, and I'm quoting here, "It's been going on for a very long time. You know what the crime is. The crime is very obvious to everybody." And a few days later, he says, "It's the greatest political scandal in the history of the United States. And we don't know what the accusation is." It's not just that there's no event, there's no claim.
I know we're trying to follow it from here, but it's hard for reporters to even report on the issue. I know. I mean, let me ask you, a lot of this book really does have to do with Trump. And so the question is, I know you said you're not creating a typology here, but do you see evidence of this kind of thinking outside of Trump land? I mean, outside of America and other parts of the world, or can you identify it anywhere else?
I have no confidence in answering that question. I really haven't done a comparative study. I think there's no question that all kinds of regimes use conspiracy theory for political purposes. And I would imagine that what we're calling conspiracy without the theory or conspiracism is also useful, because the same sort of dynamic that operates, the use of the internet and the fact that it's true enough and that you can say a lot of people are saying it and you can spread it quickly and so on, goes on. So it's not unique to the United States. However, and I think that to the extent that these conspiracy claims have proved useful, it's going to be a political weapon that other people will use. It's not going to disappear. And the expansiveness and explosion of conspiracism in social networking and so on, I think, is here to stay. And in part because politics is always interesting, and this is a new political weapon. And in part because it's fun. You know, we shouldn't forget that there's an excitement to this kind of conspiracism on social networks and on the internet. And some of it is invented just for fun. It's just, you know, my favorite one of these ones that the entrepreneurs created and the people circulate is that there are no birds anymore, that the birds that you see are really drones. And John Kennedy tried to stop the murdering of the birds, and that's why he was assassinated. So
my favorite right now is QAnon, because I tried to do ethnographic research and get into the QAnon, world mindset instead of just reading about it. But I found it very hard because it's not so easy to find them. I mean, I think the algorithm doesn't help people like me.
Right.
Is this partly technology who drives us towards it? That drives people towards certain echo chambers?
Yes, clearly it is, but it's also the fact that, QAnon is a good example of this, actually. That there's a kind of, as I say, excitement. There's a kind of aggressive fun and assertion in all of this. And QAnon is a terrific example because, on the one hand, QAnon is like a game. That is, say, who is this anonymous person spreading information about when the storm is going to come and Trump is going to overtake all the enemies and lock up George Soros and lock up all the Democrats and so on and so forth. There's a fun to it. And it's actually like a collective creation. That is, people write in their opinions about it and the novel expands to some sort of collective writing. It has its sort of cultural engagement of a certain interesting kind. On the other hand, QAnon is a serious thing because the QAnon, unlike an awful lot of these, is out there in public spaces. They, go to rallies, they intimidate people, and they have an apocalyptic vision. And I'm always very worried when conspiracists or anybody have an apocalyptic vision, because it leads to the expectation and possibly to the enactment of certain kinds of cataclysmic violence. And the belief that out of this cataclysm, out of QAnon and the storm, will come a better world. This is a very, very attractive idea to people, and it has a quasi-religious overtones. You've probably heard that for some evangelicals and for QAnon, Trump is the chosen one. And so the fact that they're out there in public makes me think that it's not implausible that you will have violence coming out of this.
Nancy, maybe another, methodological question. Where do you see the overlap between new conspiracism and populism as we understand it in theory?
I think you write that they share a sort of anti-pluralism. How does that work?
Well, just as conspiracism today delegitimizes political opposition, populism, and this is a gross generalization, populism claims that there's one true people, and that those who are in the way of this one true people have no claim in democracy. So there is a kind of totalism to both conspiracism and to populism. But I think that there's no necessary connection between them. I mean, I think that populist movements have no particular reason to engage in disinformation or to engage in bizarre concoctions of the conspiracist kind. There's no reason to think that populists are incapable of or reject political evidence and political argumentation of an understandable form, recognizable form. There's no real sense. So I'll just leave it there. I don't think that there's any necessary connection. And I don't see it particularly today. I mean, I don't know whether we want to call Trump's supporters populist or not. I'm disinclined to. Does that answer your question?
Sure. I mean, we need to end. We were just hoping maybe if you can give us one word of, is there any hopeful way to end this? Is there any good strategy? I mean, Gilad discussed it before, speaking truth to the conspiracists. What is the route towards a more fact-based society?
Let me ask it differently. If Trump loses the November elections, do you think anything will change?
That's a better question.
Absolutely, they will. Because as I've said, what's making this politically dangerous, beyond just the obvious dangers that come from this kind of thinking, is the capacity of people in high power to reorganize institutions and to impose these conspiracist claims on the nation and to use it in political ways that are delegitimating and disorienting. That's not to say the conspiracism will disappear, either in the culture or on the internet or even in politics. But once you have a change of president and party, you will have a dramatic change. That's not to say that it won't take a long time to reconstruct the institutions that have been disturbed by this, hijacked and degraded and so on. I think there's a lot that it will take a long time. But there is a carrier here. There is a person carrying this and a supine political party that has allowed this to continue. And if they are stripped of some of their power, some of the power of conspiracism will disappear as well.
All right. Nancy Rosenblum, professor of ethics in politics and government at Harvard University and the author of the new book. A lot of people are saying the new conspiracism and the assault on democracy. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to Eitai Shelem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and once again to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for sponsoring this series. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have over 500 interviews. Like us on Facebook. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.